Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories. But now, we introduce you to them.
This position is now under direct fire. Go!
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
This is another example of Lebanese people taking matters into their own hands. American journalists!
In this episode, we celebrate 3 years of Vice News Tonight on Vice TV and hear from the reporters that have covered generation-defining stories in every corner of the globe, from a presidential assassination in Haiti to the fight for housing rights here in the U.S.
Go!
Well, it's nice to see you all in person. Thank you guys for getting together. This is likely the last time we'll do a Field Notes together for a while, and marking an occasion of having made Vice News Tonight for 3+ years together. Nice to see you. Liz, I'm trying to think back to those early shows.
Yeah.
And we were talking a lot, maybe every night, because it was like primary season 2020.
We were, but we were also doing it live, which I want to remind everyone. And I think you launched it live.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us how it was doing a live show, because that was not really what Vice had done before.
Sure. I mean, we did a live show for like 2 weeks because COVID happened and we had to kind of go down. But I mean, I never thought I would be the host or an anchor of a nightly news show. That like was never what I thought I'd do with my life. And so I was pretty surprised to do it to begin with. Like if you think about it, it was February 2020.
Yeah.
We were in Times Square at a studio and we saw Times Square clear out day by day because as the news of the pandemic started, so did the sort of social distancing and restrictions. And that was also happening while the heat of the primary season was going on. And so it was a learning experience from the minute we stepped into the studio.
And we paused the show, right?
Mm-hmm.
We launched it in a studio in Times Square, and then the pandemic hit, and then had to recalibrate everything.
So after the Times Square thing, we just started filming it from my apartment. And so it wasn't live anymore, and I think we went to half hour at that point. Mm-hmm. And I would have Amber Sizemore, our line producer, on speakerphone, and I'd memorize the throws and intros that I was doing.
So no teleprompter.
There was no teleprompter.
Whoa.
Wow.
Which was...
That's impressive.
That's
impressive.
I mean, at first we were writing pretty complex little turns of phrases and lots of facts, and like that's kind of what we thought the job was. And soon, me and the writing staff realized, like, let's slim this down because I have to memorize all
The
this.
memorizing was the worst when you're home and you're just recording all your stuff yourself and doing all your own audio, and all the interviews are on Zoom. And that was a mess in the beginning.
I think also navigating when we started going back out into the field, some folks were starting to go back in April and May. And even then, thinking about the number of masks you needed to carry on you, the number of bottles of sanitizer you needed, where you were going to stay, how you were going to get around, how far you were going to have to stand away from your interview subjects to safely distance yourself, but also continue reporting. And I think a lot of journalists had those kind of considerations going into the field. And
a lot of logistics.
We did, I'm now remembering this, an interview with the Surgeon General.
Yeah.
I remember
outside of HHS in Washington, and we were placed 20 feet apart from one another. I mean, it was like we were yelling at each other to try to have this conversation.
There's been mixed signals, not only coming out of the CDC and some of the White House task force about things, but also from the president. He said, that he was optimistic that everything would be open by Easter. Now, we know that that's just not going to be the case in this country. He said, he read the CDC guidelines about wearing a mask the other day and then said immediately, I'm not going to wear one. Do his contradictory statements from the White House podium make it harder for you to do your job right now?
Well, I think in many cases, things are portrayed as conflict more so than what they actually are. What we've always said is that we are hopeful, we are aspirational.
But it's not really a conflict, though. It's two separate messages. You as the leading doctor in the country saying one thing, and then the president You know, you said yesterday that this is this country's 9/11 moment again. It's Pearl Harbor. And then President Trump is tweeting today it's a light at the end of the tunnel. How does that not make your job difficult?
Well, those were both true. 9/11, Pearl Harbor, they were terrible tragedies, terrible moments in our history, but they were also moments where the country came together, bonded, and came out stronger for it at the end. I'm hopeful that, well, not just hopeful, we absolutely need America to understand that even though this week is going to be tragic, the public has the power to change the trajectory of this epidemic.
We made the calculation basically when everything started to happen outside of the White House, when the George Floyd protests happened in the Midwest, and then it moved to Washington, and the former President Trump became increasingly vocal about it. We had to get out there and cover it, and I think that it was some of the best work that we've done, and we all did it in the middle of a pandemic, out in the field all over the country.
It was a purpose-driven time, I think, as people who are reporting. And, you know, there was times where, I remember, Michael, when you got pepper sprayed out there. And there was, you know, it was freighted with purpose, but also peril.
It seemed like there was a shift. Being out in the middle of the protests, it almost felt like COVID didn't exist anymore. It was like this was even more important, even though there was a risk involved to it. I did value the fact that we were able to go, that we were allowed to go and to be there.
Yeah, I would argue that
it
went from 2 era-defining stories into 3, because I think with BLM and COVID absolutely affected the election. And I didn't get here until October 2020. My first time on Vice News Tonight was live on election night in Philadelphia. That was my first time ever on air. So and I remember my story was about, you know, this kind of small county in Pennsylvania that had a bunch of COVID deniers, and how they were, you know, not sure, you know, if they were going to trust the results even back then, if Trump were to eventually lose. But to go from those 2 things into elections, it just was non-stop. And we're not even at insurrection yet, right? We're still in October, November. During that had to be one of the craziest years.
What's going to happen here? All the counties are handling it differently. Plus, what's the Supreme Court going to do? They still said they might rule on the mail-in ballots not being able to be counted 3 days after Election Day.
What do you think about the days ahead?
I think Pennsylvania is going to be the Florida, you know, with Bush Gore.
This is one of the polling places that Snover was concerned about, but voters didn't seem to mind waiting to cast their ballots in person.
Why did you decide to cast your ballot in person instead of a mail-in ballot this year?
Just based on what I've heard in the news and, you know, facts that are shown in the media of how things can go missing and corrupt, that I feel it's important for me to be here live to make sure my ballot is cast appropriately.
I voted by pushing a button for 50 years, and I'm going to continue to push a button.
Are you prepared to accept if Trump loses?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll need to see more and hear more of what happened, because we feel they've been trying to steal it all along.
The day of January 6th, we filmed a show, and of course, we planned on covering what happened. And as we were prepping, we see the feed of they're inside the Capitol.
I couldn't believe I was sitting in the middle of a canoe in a swamp in Georgia for this other story, and we're just scrolling these pictures, what on earth is happening? And I remember you guys were in Georgia for those other stories, and it was just suddenly nothing else mattered.
Michael, you've been covering stuff in Haiti a bunch as well, and I think contemporaneously, roughly to that time, there was a huge shakeup there.
Being on the ground in Haiti, you know, a few months, I guess it was almost 6 months before President Moïse was killed, you know, you kind of saw the same kind of anger on the streets that you saw at January 6th. And so we negotiated a moment to speak with him, and I think we were the last English-speaking outlet to interview him. And 6 months later, you know, we find out that he's assassinated, and we're back on a plane back to Haiti to go, you know, to cover the unrest that was unfolding post-assassination and trying to figure out what happened. And for people in Haiti, I mean, it's just been one thing after another for over a decade.
Right.
And it's been really, really tough to see even journalists that we worked really close with, you know, being killed by rival gangs there. And so that's just been a story that's been pretty close to what I've done here, and that's been kind of hard to look back on.
Can you describe what the people who took your daughter, what they looked like? Et ça me te ouais sous monsieur, c'était maillot te sous yo avec pantalon jeans. Bon, monsieur pas de cagoule. Yo kidnappé li dimanche, il fait lundi, mardi, dans mercredi yo relem. Il dit madame on bail $4,000 américains. Dit mes amis bon Dieu papa. M'bagé 4,000 ti roche. Qui dit m'dagé $4,000 américains. Dans dimanche, c'est un saut de am campé m'tap balé et puis m'tendon monsieur dit monsieur a de quoi son boule petit yo tué non monsieur. L'aime courir sorti dehors. Il dit al sou pont après. Et puis m'courir pied à terre là qui balé à terre. M'courir pied à terre mal gardé. L'aime rive moi c'est petite moi. Assez m'bat penser petite femme nan que yo te ka tué. I
mean, for all of you, I mean, anything stand out in your mind? Anything that you look back on and you're like,
Mina,
yeah. That's kind of stuck.
I want to say something I'm most proud of you for. That Hawaii story was
proud or
incredible.
jealous? I don't know.
A little bit of Hawaii. The Hawaii story, yeah. I'm obviously jealous
special.
because you got to go to Hawaii, but it was a really tough story.
Yeah, no, that was special. The U.S. military has this World War II era fuel facility in Oahu, and we did interviews with this whistleblower who says it's been leaking for decades, just quietly into the ground and into potentially the water supply for the island. And there was this catastrophic leak, and we traveled there to meet the military families who were affected by this leak. So basically, this fuel facility leaked all this jet fuel into the water supply for 90,000 people on the island, pretty much all military families, people who lived in base housing near Pearl Harbor. And then they just didn't admit it. So, we met this really amazing family where the mother really strongly believes that her daughter's health conditions, which predate that catastrophic spill, but are from when they arrived on the island, that they're directly linked to this fuel facility.
Every 3 weeks, we have to get her blood done. And I just think of having to hold her down while she's begging me to leave or mommy, please make them stop. She's like, I won't drink that water anymore. I think she feels like she's being punished. And I don't know how to have that conversation to make her understand that it was never you. There was none of this is you.
I think those are some of our best stories where there is no clear answer.
Yeah.
And that, most of the time, those are the most interesting ones because there are so many different sides. I remember your story. I mean, every time I was like, I want to do a house story, Dan was on it.
Yeah, Dan, you were on a lot of house stories.
Yeah, talk about that. I remember the one you did in California. That was
I loved that piece.
It was such a good story.
We did a 3-part series about housing in California. The first story was people who live on boats in the Bay Area. The second story was people in a mobile home park in Fresno, and the third story was people living homeless in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. I think that was an incredibly rewarding experience, just to cover people living on the margins of society in this nationwide crisis where California is kind of like the worst example of what could happen in the US and just how unaffordable housing is for everyone. And I think those stories really resonated online with people because in the US, everyone is experiencing this.
So what the city is offering people is long-term shelter living. Part of the model of Kensington campus is permanent supportive housing. It's filled up, and for folks like this, I don't think that's accessible either.
What is the solution?
Real housing. These policy decisions to disinvest in affordable housing go back a few decades and have been the result of neglect by all levels of government. Outreach and services will not end houselessness. Housing will end houselessness.
Krishna, I know you were, in your host bag for a while, but you were still in the field. Tell us about some of your favorite V&T pieces.
Thanks, Alexis, for asking. One that I think about a lot is I got my start, so to speak, covering pot, but the story that I think about a lot is a story we did about equity licenses in Chicago, in Illinois. So effectively, a lot of states these days have programs where they're trying to give some preference to folks who are impacted by the war on drugs, a leg up in getting licenses to start and operate cannabis businesses, which is effectively like a money printing machine right off the top. So in Chicago, there were some problems with that, which is to say there was a very complicated lottery, people were unhappy, and it was a really interesting time to go and talk to people about the promises of policies that came from like an activist community that were now being put into place by government officials who were effectively of a generation that changed the page on cannabis reform.
Former State Senator Ricky Hendon is a mainstay of West Chicago life and applied for a dispensary license. He was left out of the lottery and left wondering about the loopholes in the equity program.
They have a clause that says if you promise to hire 6 minorities, you qualify as a social equity applicant.
That's all you need. You have to promise to hire 6 people who are Black, who are...
Or Latino, you qualify as a social equity applicant.
Just hire them.
Just hire them.
And so these are all social equity applicants.
Supposedly.
Is there a danger that social equity programs are over-promising? The process itself is so onerous. Going against big money is such a tough thing.
If Governor J.B. Pritzker gets this wrong, he will not be reelected. There's a different kind of activism out here now. We ain't taking that shit no more.
One thing I've noticed and am very impressed by, and I see from all of you, is we really listen. Like I think sometimes you can make a piece, you've done the reporting prior to the trip, you've written it out, you've got your pitch, then you're in the field and you're kind of trying to put it together. But I can see as you guys are making these pieces how you're listening to the people who are talking to you. And that's affecting the way that you're actually telling the story.
I think
that's something that's kind of unique. You
it's
can
also
tell.
a product of the format. Like, we were talking about why Vice, and you mentioned like the 30-second soundbite. It's like we know that we're going to use at least 2-3 minutes of this. So it really does just become a conversation. You're not listening just to get your other questions in, because those questions might not even make the cut. It's just these moments, those are the best moments when you're really responding to what they're saying, and the fact that we have space in our pieces to let those moments breathe. You really don't find that anywhere else.
I mean, we're incredibly lucky. We can call up pretty much anybody and they'll let us into their home, into their life.
Rearrange their living room.
And give us like days, hours, you can't be luckier than that with people. They're just so generous with their time and their, families. And it's just like really an incredible opportunity that we've all had. And I think we represent a tiny fraction of the amount of work that goes into these pieces. Like every piece we work on is like 10 plus people are touching it, from all the pre-production to all the people you're with in the field to all the people who help you put it together when you get back.
Shout out to Post.
Yeah, I mean, we just couldn't do our jobs without this like massive team behind us, and I think we have been incredibly lucky to be allowed into these people's spaces.
Vice and our bosses, and frankly our colleagues, there's not an emphasis on scoops, breaking news, getting little nuggets here and there from sources who have their reason for doing that, and especially in political reporting. And I think that we all go out in the field and we ask the question, no matter who it is, whether the person is powerful or not powerful, but especially when the person is powerful, we can ask that question. And I think that has made, I think people notice that in our reporting. I hear it from people that watch our show who say, thank you for actually asking that. But I think we're all doing that when we're out there. You're getting a response, shedding light on those kinds of things and holding people to account has certainly, I think, distinguished our political reporting and a lot of the other stuff that we do on Vice News Tonight.
Dan, coming from, you were doing a lot of print and then transitioned to a lot being on camera.
Yeah,
right?
I started
What was
as
it like on both those sides of Vice, and what was kind of your favorite part?
I started as a producer here, and actually before Vice, I came from Al Jazeera English, so international broadcast news. I think one of the things, and it's been talked about already, that's so special about this place is not having like a 3-minute limit to telling a story. And the thing that our bosses often say to us is just make the story as long as it needs to be. If a story justifies a 15-minute runtime, they'll let us do it. They'll let us tell it in its complexity.
Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. Thank you guys for coming in and talking today. It was just a pleasure to get together and an honor to work together. And I know we will in some capacity in the future, and we'll see what it holds. Thank you guys for watching. Also, everyone at home who watches these field notes pieces, who watches everything on YouTube. Like, we do read the comments. We were talking about that earlier.
And we respond to them.
We respond to them. And, you know, I mean, knowing that we reach people with these stories, I think is part of what makes it so
worthwhile.
Such worthwhile work. Yeah. So thank you.